Cool. All right. So if you haven't figured it out by my name tag already, my name is Alden Rower. Um, I've lived in Washtenaw County my entire life, and I would like to take a minute to introduce myself and my colleagues. We are the Project for Advancement and Cultural Transformation, or PACT. Our group formed in response to the recent civil unrest and social divides in our country in order to provide ourselves and our peers with a clearer idea of what can be done. We're here to just have an open conversation with you. We have some questions, but if you have stuff that you want to say, just in opening, go right ahead.
Yeah, no, I was watching the board meeting the other day, maybe a couple weeks ago now, when some of you were speaking. And as soon as I heard a few of you speak, I said, oh, let me find out who they are, just put my name out there and introduce myself, learn much more about what you all do, and do exactly this dialogue, see if there's questions that I can answer. I'm a social worker who became a police officer. So this is a part of my job. I'm the director of community engagement. So my entire job is around building bridges with the community, thinking about non-traditional ways, how you change policing from the inside out. And just so some of the words that you all stated at the board meeting really resonated with me, but also I hadn't heard of the group before. So I was just really interested in learning and just, again, establishing that relationship. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you all may have.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming. We just started about a month and a half ago, so we're slowly building our presence within the community, and we'll see how long this lasts. So I think we can go to our questions now.
Hi, I have the first question. I am Emma. So what are your department's thoughts and positions on the Black Lives Matter movement that is currently going on?
Yeah, so I guess I would say, let me step back to the first iteration of Black Lives Matter, when kind of Black Lives Matter first came into fruition several years ago. Again, as a part of my job, I get to walk in this kind of middle ground between community and policing. And so Black Lives Matter, defunding the police, abolishing the police, none of those are scary conversations, to be candid. I mean, those are conversations that we're having internally anyway. And so in the first iteration of Black Lives Matter, when they first were introduced years ago, some of the leaders were my personal friends. Some of the leaders here locally were. And so the first thing we did was meet with them, get the sheriff in front of them to hear what their demands were, but also to do this. And what we found quickly was that what they were asking for was nothing different than what we were already asking for internally. So again, for us, it's not anything new or scary. It's not as if we have a contentious relationship. When some of the local protests happened, again, they were personal friends of mine, of people who are asking for the exact same things. Of the reasons that I went into law enforcement in the first place was to make changes, to do police reform. I just decided to do it from the inside out versus from the outside in. And so our relationship, and I think is one of mutual respect. I think want a lot of the same exact things. I think we're just doing it maybe from two different paths, inside and outside, but a lot of the same values, I would say, in what we ultimately want out of policing. Hopefully that answers it. I guess to put it quite simple is like, we support the mission of Black Lives Matter.
You actually mentioned this a little bit, like defunding the police and all of that. So what is that seen as a valid option in the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office, or I don't know, because we're definitely not advocating for an abolishment of the police, and I would say a very small minority of people are. But what does that look like if maybe you were to pursue that, or are you even thinking of pursuing that? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say the way I look at it is from a number of different areas. So I'll just talk about defunding the police or abolishment or any of them. What we often say is for any large structure or building like a skyscraper, if you wanted to demolish it, before you can run in and throw dynamite all over and hit detonate, and blow it up, right? Like you really need to understand the current construct and the structure, know what its weaknesses and vulnerabilities are, what its strengths are, and then you need to build alternative structures to kind of move stuff into before you blow up the building. And the same thing for police reform or abolishment or defunding. I think the biggest thing for me is just making sure people fully understand the current construct. And then once they do, then people like yourselves can make the best determination of what should really change. So that's the first part, is just making sure people understand it. I've been fortunate enough to kind of work at a police agency for the last 12 years. So I've really learned internally, okay, here's how it works and here's how some of the things can change. So that's kind of one way that I look at it. The other is, we've already started to do some stuff around defunding. Sorry, that's my daughter calling on every phone that I have and on my computer. If I hang up on her on one, she starts to call back on another. So we've already started to do defunding. So defunding to us is not something new. So Washtenaw County right now, and here she calls again for the third time. Washtenaw County is not. Washtenaw County is the only county that has a public safety and mental health millage that was passed by the people, and it passed 2 years ago. And the reason that millage passed was because in Washtenaw County, people really value human services or behavioral health kinds of stuff instead of doing stuff related to like incarceration, right? And so for us, they passed the millage. A lot of that money goes to mental health services. Some does go to police, but how we're using it is around diversion and deflection stuff. And so I often look at, in Washtenaw County, we're already doing defunding of police, or in some ways, reallocation of resources towards behavioral health versus just for policing. So I'll give you a couple of examples of how that's happened here in Washtenaw. So right now we have something called this 24-hour crisis team. It's at community mental health. So it's all social workers and therapists. They've trained with law enforcement. They have a 24-hour number. And so if one of our deputies shows up to a scene and finds out it's actually a mental health call or a mental health crisis, they just pick up the phone or have dispatch call that 24/7 number, and a social worker shows up immediately. So again, it's kind of reallocating resources to get the social workers or the experts to deal with what they're supposed to deal with. And then we can go on about our business and deal with other things. There's something else called the assessment center. Very similar thing, but if an officer comes into contact with someone who doesn't necessarily need to go to jail, because the other part is there's really two options, is jail or like psych ER or like the hospital, right? And neither one of them is the best option sometimes. So there's something called the assessment center in Washtenaw County, where an officer picks someone up. Instead of having to arrest them and only take them to jail or the hospital, they can drop them off at this assessment center. And at the assessment center, they can stay for up to 23 hours. So it has to be less than a full day. But they're dropped off and they're dealing with social workers to do an assessment and find out what needs that they have. So those are just two of the tools that have come from the millage that allows us to not have officers doing the work that really other professionals should do. So we've trained our officers in how to triage mental health stuff, which is just the basics. But we've also tried to build those other tools in the system so that officers can slowly but surely stop showing up to the calls. Our next piece, to be quite honest, is to have residents not call 911 in the first place, to have residents start to be comfortable with calling the 24/7 line so that a deputy never shows up, right? Like it's a social worker that shows up immediately. So the system is there. It's just educating the community to start calling the 24/7 number instead of calling 911. So hopefully that gets to it, but that's a part of what my job is, designing those alternative systems. We've been trying to do that for the last several years.
Well, yeah, I think you touched on that like a lot. You pretty much answered that. I was wondering, there's just something similar in Dallas, basically only where they incorporate social workers and police into the same 911. Like if someone calls 911, the person there will either pass it on to the sheriff, like deputies. So I was wondering if people, because I didn't know about that hotline actually. So do you think it might eventually be incorporated into, like if a person calls 911, a trained specialist will be able to answer the call and direct it either to social workers or to deputy, so that not necessarily like you have to know of the hotline to get mental health help? That makes sense.
Absolutely. And you're touching on a really great point that sometimes people forget about when they talk about police reform, and that's really the role of dispatch. So, dispatchers taking that information, so making sure they're well trained and they know the resources, like you were just saying. So, yes, it happens from time to time right now, but we really do need to move to a point where it's more regular, right? So, you're right. If someone calls 911 regardless of for whatever, a dispatcher is skilled enough to pull out the behaviors and then direct it to where they go. Right now, historically, dispatchers have only directed it to two places, or really three: an ambulance, like for medical, fire, or for police. And so now you're right. We haven't gotten there yet. It happens sometimes. But more so what happens is we dispatch it to a supervisor, like a sergeant, and then the sergeant makes that call to say, okay, should it go to CMH or should it go to deputies? And part of that is just us getting better and learning how to really dispatch it to multiple places. The fear is when someone calls the police, they want a police response. And what we're moving towards now is, no, not necessarily. They just want help. And that help could be from a lot of different places. So great question. We're just not fully there yet, but that's our goal, is to move to a really fluid, integrated system. So regardless of wherever you call, you get to the right person, not just to law enforcement.
I have one more follow-up to this question. Do you think community mental health is receiving enough support, both on a local scale, and then if they receive state support, are they able to keep functioning and grow as necessary?
So the quick answer is no, they're not receiving enough support, right? Like right now, our community mental health in Washtenaw, there's a $10 million deficit. And now we're asking them to do even more stuff. We've been fortunate, we've had a couple of federal grants that have come in through the sheriff's office or a contract with the sheriff's office. And then again, that millage really helps us out a lot. So the public safety and mental health millage in Washtenaw County is roughly $18 million a year. A third of it goes right to community mental health for diversion, deflection work. A third of it comes to the sheriff's office. And a third of it goes to the local. So there are like cities like Ann Arbor that has their own police department. And so a third of the millage goes right to Ann Arbor. Now the key is the voters voted for it a certain way, but really it's up to city council to decide how they spend it. So in Ann Arbor, they decided to spend it on non-police stuff. They started spending it on bike paths and roads and stuff like that, which is their decision, but that's not diversion stuff. That's something totally separate. So like the same thing with Ypsi City, they get part of that money and they get to choose from city council how they use it. So there is some relief in Washtenaw County, but again, we're the only county with that kind of millage. So across the state, there's definitely not the level of financial support for community mental health. And I would just add, even beyond community mental health, some of our local human services that could step in and do that work, there still need to be the resources to help them to do that stuff as well, right? Like an Ozone House or a Corner Health Center, some of those places can easily do the work if they had the resources as well. And great questions, because what you all are talking about is the larger systems and construct. Again, even if you wanted to abolish police, when we started letting people out of the jail early because of COVID, I literally had people standing in our parking lot who just got out of jail with nowhere to go. There were no systems to send them to. So if someone was in active addiction and they were supposed to go to, say, Dawn Farm or Home of New Vision, well, those two places had temporarily closed at the beginning of COVID. So even though the court said they had to go to Dawn Farm, they physically couldn't get into Dawn Farm. So they were just standing in the parking lot. So I think that's just an example of the good questions you all are asking about those alternative systems. If we're going to do this work, how do we make sure we have the systems to do it right?
What is your response to people who ask for a complete abolishment of the police?
Wait, can you say that one more time?
What is your response to the people who ask for complete abolishment of the police?
I think the quickest response I say is like, well, even if that's what we all want, we're not there, and it's probably not going to happen tomorrow or anytime soon. So in the meantime, what do we do to move and get law enforcement down a particular path to get better every single day? So it's a part of why I work at the sheriff's office is how do we get better? I know this. I live in a neighborhood and I grew up in a neighborhood where there were certain violent crimes, right? There's a pretty high crime rate in certain areas. I know we don't want to be over police, but we also call the police a lot for violent or serious crimes. And so there is a role for policing. And often what I say is, it's not the tool. My grandfather used to always tell me it's how the tool is used, right? And so it's not the police themselves, but it's how the system was constructed. And so what if we could do things a little bit differently and use police only for certain crimes, or teach police certain things, and I'll give you an example. If you look at a police budget and you look at training, just look at how much money they spend on training and on what kind of training. So if I'm only spending money on use of force, like how to shoot straight, how to fight, how to drive fast, then naturally I'm teaching my staff that those are the tools that they should use, and that's what they feel comfortable with because they keep getting trained in it. What if I train them in verbal de-escalation, procedural justice, um, 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 bias, implicit bias, and some of those other kind of human service kind of things? Now I'm balancing use of force, which you might have to use sometimes, with all the skills you use on an everyday basis. And so now the tool of policing becomes balanced versus only on force and enforcement. And so that's usually what I say is like, I got you. And even if that's where we want to go, it's going to take us some time to get there. So in the meantime, how do we get better?
Are there any issues within WCSO or other local police departments that could be addressed by actually implementing these demands?
So yes, there's a ton of stuff, right, of like how we get better every single day. So, you know, some of the things like, what was it? I just blanked on the name of it, but it was like, if you do these 8 things, you can lower death by police. Like we've done all 8 of those, and we've had those since as long as I've been here, we've had those. So that's been 12 years. So those are kind of low hanging fruit pieces that I think every police agency around the country should have. Like one was like to ban chokeholds, those kind of things. Absolutely, you can do all of those. For us, it's about policy. Yes, it's about training. Yes, but it's also about behavioral change. So putting all 3 of those things together, if I have a certain policy and a certain training, that gets me to a certain point. But if I still have at my core certain beliefs, when my anxiety raises and I get in the middle of a heated situation, I'm going to go, yes, partly to training, but I'm going to go back to my personal values. So what we're trying to do change is values, right? How do you change someone's perception of community, those kinds of things. So the kind of people we're hiring, I think is huge. So yes, it has to be training, it has to be policy, but it also has to be the kind of folks you're bringing in. One of the things that I'm really big on, and it's a more long-term solution, is how do we get people from neighborhoods like I lived in where we police the most interested in becoming police officers? Because once I became a police officer, I look at my neighborhood different, right? No matter what I may be taught in the police academy or what some of those agency values are, I know where I came from. And so I'm, of course, going to treat people a certain way. So that kind of recruitment is long-term. Like, how do you work with young people to want to be a police officer 10, 15, 20 years down the road? But it's something I think is definitely needed. So that's one. The other part is every agency is a little bit different. In Washtenaw County, you have 9 agencies if you include the university police. And so they're all governed by some certain state standards, but the sheriff is my boss. The chief of police at a city, their boss is really the mayor and city council. So each one is slightly different based on community values, and that can be confusing to people. What we consider important training is not necessarily as important to the next agency right next door. I'm the only person in our county that does this kind of work. And so some of our smaller police agencies, they don't have someone like me who is interacting with people like you all the time, learning and teaching and doing all that stuff. And so I think they miss a piece. That, to me personally, would be something that I think every agency can use. Like, how do you get social workers more involved, not just from a responding to a mental health call, but like at the administrative level, thinking about policy and thinking about training and thinking about like reentry. That's the other thing for us. We run the jail, so jail reentry is a big part of us when we think about reform. A lot of people don't think about corrections, but that's also a huge piece for us. So some stability and continuity across agencies, I think, is a big thing, even outside of Washtenaw County, that really needs to be addressed.
I had a follow-up question to something you said earlier about training. I was discussing with a friend at one point about how, like, what are the requirements to become a police officer, and do you feel like it's enough to become a police officer with what?
Nope. Yeah, so do I think it's enough? No. I went to school longer to be a social worker than a police officer. So think about that, right? I went through undergrad for 4 to 5 years, graduated, went to grad school for 2 years, got my master's in social work, and then it took me 17 weeks to become a police officer. And so although it's rigorous to become a police officer in those 17 weeks, because it's 7 days a week, all day long, that's not enough time when you think about law enforcement or police officer is the only job that has the legal authority to take away what we value most, our life and our freedom. Right? So arresting someone or using deadly force. And so with that, you can imagine that there needs to be even more intensive steps in place. And so, yeah, I definitely would advocate for even more intensive steps beyond the 17-week academy. And I think those are some of the conversations that are also happening. The academy is just the first step. So people do go through a police academy, you become certified. And then once you become certified, you go into your agency and you're in this, we call it a PTO or a police training program. You are in that police training program for much longer. And so it really does combine the police academy with your local agency's training and orientation. Those two things go hand in hand to officially become an officer. So it really is longer than 17 weeks. But you can get hired by someone after those 17 weeks, 16 or 17 weeks, depending on which academy. But because of the authority we have, it just makes sense to have a very high bar and standard for who can become a police officer.
This question has a bit of overlap with some of the others, but what has been the department's response historically to large-scale protests or large-scale civil rights movements? And do you think will that change going forward?
So historically, if you really think way back to Washtenaw County, way before any of us were around, there are stories and horror stories of in the 60s and marches at U of M's campus where the sheriff's office was a part of the enforcement to, break down and tear down those protests. Here locally, again, I think partly because of my role, but also partly just because that's the way we think about protests now at the sheriff's office is we've tried to be as helpful as possible, not to get in the way, but also to protect folks in their right to free speech and to protest. If you look at some of the videos, or if you were at some of the protests, they were at the sheriff's office, some of them. And I was out there, talking to the organizers before and saying, hey, what do you need? Not to know what you're doing, but to make sure it's safe. If you're going to march in the road, we can make sure we block off certain intersections so that folks who aren't paying attention or disagree won't come flying through the crowd. So all of our protests, we've tried to be as helpful as possible. And I think that's had a positive ripple effect on folks. So again, we look at it as, the way that I look at it is twofold. You need folks on the inside, right? Like trying to make change to any system. Not just law enforcement, but you also need people pushing from the outside. And so as people push, what I often say is if you only push from the outside, those who are on the inside who don't want to see change, they'll just build bigger and stronger walls to keep you out. You need some folks on the inside to get in there and open the door and let you come in or to kind of help change some things. So I definitely think it's necessary. And for us, I don't think it'll change to a negative. I think it'll just continue to get better as far as us making sure that people have the right to protest. We see it as a right to free speech, but also, again, we're not afraid of those difficult conversations. Just like me reaching out to you all, I didn't know really what you stood for, if you wanted to abolish police, if you hate the police. I didn't know any of that, but I was really intrigued by a group of young people who had some pretty, I think, important things to say when I listened to your voices that day. And so our first instinct is to reach out, not to hide from it.
So what changes due to normal societal evolution as well as the recent protests do you foresee in the way WCSO works in the community?
So I guess, what I just see from policing overall is, and I think it's important to state this, is I don't care what police agency you are, even if you're one, this is this old traditional policing, you have to feel the pressure of the community asking for police and demanding for police reform and things to change. You see it all over the place, right? Whether it's NASCAR taking down and banning the Confederate flag, or other agencies or other legislators demanding certain things or defunding in certain pieces. Like the wave is coming, right? And people feel it regardless of where you're at in the country. And people and law enforcement are talking about it. Now, some are resistant to it, don't get me wrong, but I think people are all paying attention because they have to. They're forced to right now. What kind of changes do I think come into Washtenaw County Sheriff specifically? Honestly, I think it allows us to do things that we've wanted to do that even for us have been slow in moving. So right now, just last week, we announced having residents or kind of community members on our hiring committee. So for us, we've talked about doing that for a long time. Now it makes it easy to do that, right? People are asking for it, they're demanding it, and now we're just going to do it. So the application is up right now for people to put in to be a part of that hiring committee. And so to think about that, having residents or community members a part of every hiring process in the sheriff's office, so the community has the power to have a say in who we hire and not hire, to me, that's pretty significant. And that's happening because of some of the protests, or made easier because of some of the protests. The other thing is our 21st Century Policing Commission, which also was just announced. So, you know, President Obama back in 2014 had this commission around police reform, and it was called the 21st Century Policing Commission, and they released these 6 pillars of recommendations. We've been using those 6 pillars, and so what our local commission is going to do is not only learn about what the original report said, but then they're going to evaluate us as the sheriff's office on what we've done, good, bad, or indifferent. Have we really reached the threshold of those recommendations? And then after they evaluate us, talk about how we fully institute all 6 of those. So again, that's citizens and residents getting to have that oversight related to us. And then the third one that we're doing is something called the Police Reform Academy, where again, no matter if you agree with abolishment or defunding or deconstructing or small reforms, understanding the foundation of policing and law enforcement and criminal justice system, I think is really important. We've talked about doing it. We've done a citizen academy, but now we're going to do a police reform academy where we focus on the top questions and issues people have around reform, just so people know. And what's helped us is I've been doing this work for 12 years. I've been screaming as loud as I can about these things. Now people are really paying attention, and not only paying attention, like people are educating themselves on it and want to be a part of these things. And so putting that application out now, we're just getting flooded with people who want to be a part of the dialogue, which I think is huge and helpful to me. So those are 3 new things specifically for the sheriff's office that I think are really going to push us to be even better.
Yeah, I've got 2 follow-ups. One is you mentioned the Police Reform Academy. Is that to educate the community or to provide like a forum to talk about internal issues within the WCSO?
The Police Reform Academy is a combination of both. So what I'm hoping will happen is in partnership with Washtenaw My Brother's Keeper, so a separate group that focuses on men of color. And so one of the things we're hoping is that regardless of why people want to get involved in reform and what their ultimate goal is, that just learning about the basic foundations of the current construct of policing will give them the information to make the change that they think is best. And in that training, part of it is going to be around the discussions around what would you like to see happen. So that's why the first cohort in the Police Reform Academy is all Black men, just because Black men has been disproportionately affected by police brutality. So we wanted to start with that group, use their ideas for the second group, which will be elected officials, because hopefully it'll help influence potential policy that happens here locally. And then all the rest of the cohorts will just be the general population, but those future cohorts will have information given to them based on the first 2 cohorts, the elected officials and Black men in the county. And so it will be a combination of learning, but also listening to how it may influence what we do internally.
Cool, thank you. And then does the internal opinion in WCSO, the opinion of the staff, align with the opinion you're expressing and the opinion of the administration?
It's a great question. And I would say for any organization, we probably have about 30% are laggers, what we say, right? Like 30% are people who disagree. It's hard to get them on board. And then there's a large chunk, actually probably about 15 on each side. People who agree no matter what we do, people who disagree no matter what we do. So about a total of 30 on each extreme. And then, you know, roughly 70 in the middle who are kind of waiting to see, like, all right, what's going to happen? I would say now 12 years in, we've been able to really shift the culture of the sheriff's office. So one example of that is since I've been here, really is when Sheriff Clayton took over 12 years ago, almost every single command officer is new, meaning that we were able to use our evaluative standards to promote folks. The number of new staff in our agency is through the roof, meaning we've been able to use our competencies around what we think is important for an officer to bring them in, but also people now in the agency, even the ones who've been here for a long time. If you didn't like it, you had a chance to leave. if you really disagree with what we're doing. But now you've been around for a long time. You've seen what we're talking about. It's not something scary. It's not something that means you can't be a police officer. You can't do the things you want to do. It's just making your job better. And making the community better. So I think now it's taken us 12 years, but we really have shifted the culture pretty dramatically. I am sure there are those people who disagree, right? Who still work at the sheriff's office. But for the most part, I think more people agree than disagree. And here's one example of why I think that's true. We've had great people on our staff before who would never apply for a promotion because the good folks in the past those values didn't always get respected to be a promotion process. And so they would be like, why would I put myself in for a promotion when I know I'm not going to get it? Now, those folks with the values that we're looking for are the first to apply. And quite honestly, the first to get promoted. What that shows me is that internally within the staff, people feel like that cultural shift was a good thing, and then they're still here. So we have lost folks, right? We fire folks, but folks have also left on their own accord. So I think the majority of people get it, but I'd be naive to say that everybody does.
Cool. Thank you. Indigo, you can say your question. I deleted the next one.
So I know you've mentioned a few already, but what are some concrete changes within the WCSO that are happening now and have happened in the past based on protests? So like, what have your concrete changes to the department been in response to past protests and the current one?
So I guess, so yes and no in response to protests. So partly, again, part of my job is to do this. And so we've really been pushing some of these things for a long time. Like the millage was about 4 years in development before it actually happened, which again is a part of, in some ways, defunding or reallocating resources. So that was kind of pre the most recent protests. So a lot of this is things that we agree with and we're already trying to push for. I've mentioned some of the more recent things around the hiring committee, the commission, and the Police Reform Academy. Some other things, like from a community standpoint, like our Citizens Police Academy, our Junior Police Academy, we do. There's a number of things. And actually, if you look on our website under community engagement, you'll see it's called a program manual. And in there lists all the programs we have around community engagement. So those are things we've been doing systematically to engage the community, both to listen, but also to educate community. Some are one-time programs. Some are things that happen weekly or monthly or once a year, but all those things are listed out. So you can see a lot of those. I would say part of the biggest changes we've been able to make is around our training. I mentioned some of it, but like we have this thing called MIIS, Managing Interpersonal Interaction Series. And it's the mental health training, procedural justice, implicit bias, cultural competency. It's all those soft skill kinds of stuff that we put in place that for us right now, our mental health crisis training is the state recommended training. So we created it here in Washtenaw County, and the state said, this is great, let's recommend it for everyone. Now the state can't require people to take it, but they can make it a best practice and a recommendation. So I would say more specifically, I think the training is probably one of the biggest pieces. And then how we hire, what competencies we look for, the kind of officer we look for is different than what we used to look for 10, 12 years ago. So those two, I would say, are probably the most concrete, significant changes we've made.
I kind of have, I think, a final question
Okay.
from our official list. Oh.
I have one more after, but
But okay, so we have Pact. I'm sure there are other groups like us. How best can we either help make change in our community? How best can we interact with the police department to help make change? What do you recommend for our kind of group to help things?
I think what you're doing right now is it, right? Like voicing your opinions, because so police, we get our legitimacy from the community, and our values and how we operate should really reflect the community's values. And so expressing those values publicly, whether it's at the Board of Commissioners or City Council, or directly with law enforcement agencies is huge, because that's how we understand what the community's values are. And then things like this, right? Having conversations. And I would say, don't just stop with me, like have conversations, invite the sheriff on. I think it'd be great for you to hear directly from the person who's, running the agency. But even for other police agencies, I would reach out, Chief Cox in Ann Arbor or Chief DeGiusti in Ypsi, and have them come and have a conversation. Again, I think a lot of there's some foundational things that we all agree with in the community, but I think they are very different by police agencies. The other is for some of the things that I mentioned, like try to get involved in for some of the commissions and things like that, because we need not just young voices, we just need community voices. I will say that there's an absence of organized youth voices, I would say. So there's other voices that are organized, but how do we get a very organized younger voice? That's missing. This is the first, I'll just say youth group for lack of a better term, but this is the first younger group that I've had this conversation with, right? There's a ton of older adults who are involved and have their own meetings. Even in our 21st Century Policing Commission, I imagine most of the people who applied are older. So I think you all getting involved at that level would be huge for long-term change. If people are interested in law enforcement, I always like to throw this out there because I never thought I would ever be interested in law enforcement, but here I am all these years later. But there are things like the Junior Police Academy, the Explorers. We hire, excuse me, we hire people. We just hired 2 young people for the summer. One is a marine safety officer, one's working in our property room. So there are opportunities out there if you know friends or family who may be interested, not to be a police officer on the street right now, but to work in law enforcement and get to know what's going on. There are positions that are available. So I always like to throw that out there as a way some of us might be really interested in that work. So that's something else to think about.
Yeah, thank you so much. So my final question doesn't really relate to anything that we've talked about today, but it relates to what the group said, and actually I personally said during the commissioners meeting. I had written this letter that called for the police departments in Washtenaw County, but specifically Washtenaw County sheriffs, just because you were in attendance at that meeting, to ensure that your body camera policy is aligned with the CALEA standards. So is WCSO's policy aligned with that? Is it better? Is it worse? And if it's not, why?
So I think we're pretty fortunate. So the quick answer is yes, it is, and it's better. So if you go on our website, there's a link at the top that says policies. You can see not all of our policies. We're slowly but surely making them all publicly available, but you'll see some of our policies. Our use of force policy is there. You can take that and compare it against any. Partly why ours, I think, gets to be better is that our sheriff, he is one of the sheriffs around the country that the ACLU will bring in, like when they have an issue, say in a Ferguson, he's one of the consultants, he's someone who gets to travel around the country. So he gets to see and be a part of these conversations. And so he gets to see best practices around the country and then bring them back here. So for our use of force and body camera and some of those things, I think what you'll find is they go even further than some of the basic standards, which are good, but they go even further beyond that. So you can see for yourself. The policy is up for you to pull down and read it for yourself and make the comparison, particularly the use of force one. We've spent a lot of time more recently going back over the use of force. And that, to me, I think is one of the policies that are, it's like the gold standard of how we do things.
Yeah. Do you think the CALEA standards are adequate? My understanding of it is it's kind of a third-party thing and it costs a lot and takes a lot of time. Is that a good system? Is there a better system? And just what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, well, of course, all of it can be better, but I would say it does cost money and time, and so some folks don't go for it for that reason. So that's one thing to think about. I think the other piece, though, is it's always good to have standards, right? We talked about training, we talked about hiring, we talked about all these things. To be able to have a certain standard for policing, a uniform standard across the country, definitely within the state or even within the county, like having those standards, I think is really, really important. What's the teeth behind those standards? Like how do we make it so that people feel like inclined to do it, have the resources to do it, and then are held accountable to those standards? So those are things that we should probably, continue to explore. But definitely, I think CALEA standards, and it really depends on which part of CALEA. There's so many different, pieces to it. But definitely, I think it's quality standards.
Cool. Well, thank you for your time and being so open and willing to talk to us. I'm out of questions.
No, well, thank you all for, again, organizing. Again, I didn't really know anything other than what I heard you say to the Board of Commissioners, which I appreciated. So that's why I wanted to reach out. I'll just say that you all have my contact. It's in my email. If there are other questions or events or ideas you all have, part of why I wanted to meet you all is just to offer that. So some of the best things, if you look at our program manual, you'll see some programs in there. There's one called Just Cause. And it was actually, I was at a high school and I was giving a presentation and they were asking me lots of questions around police brutality. And I said, look, I'll answer all these questions, but I'll only do it if at the end we can talk about solutions. And I have 3 gift cards with me. And so the 3 best solutions, I'll give you a gift card. And one of the solutions that came from a high schooler was something called Just Cause. He said, how about you, Derrick, get like 5 police officers in a room. I'll get 5 of my friends in a room and we'll just talk over pizza just because. And sounds simple, but it was brilliant. And so now years later, we're still doing Just Cause on a regular basis. He was a part of starting the first one and helped us organize them. And we do them on a regular basis. Well, pre-COVID, we were doing it. We're ordering lunch or dinner and just meeting with different groups just to talk. And so I'll just say that some of our best ideas have come from community members, whether it's protesters, high schoolers, middle schoolers. And so if you have ideas, don't be shy about sharing them. And also don't be shy about reaching out. I think what you guys are doing is awesome. And if I can be helpful, I would greatly appreciate trying to be helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much. We'll definitely keep in touch, and I look forward to working together in the future. We as a group look forward to working together with you in the future.
Appreciate the time. You all have a good one, and let me know if I can do anything for you.
Thanks, you too. Take care.
All right.
We did it.
That was excellent.
Alden, you might want to stop recording.
Oh my gosh.